Have you ever wondered how accurate those movies are that say they're based on a true story? My name is Dan, and I'm the host of the Based on a True Story podcast, where we learn from historians, professors, authors, TV and film consultants, or sometimes even the real people the movies are based on, as they help us separate fact from fiction with what's in the movies. We've covered hundreds of movies and TV shows, so when you're ready to compare Hollywood with history, just search for your favorite movie over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com.
Wow.
Incredible. Amazing.
Lumify Redness Reliever eye drops really work.
They dramatically reduce redness in 1 minute.
I love how my eyes look whiter and brighter.
And it lasts for up to 8 hours.
They make my eyes look refreshed.
Lumify? It's kind of amazing.
It was love at first sight. With Lumify.
Try it for yourself. Learn more at lumifyeyes.com.
Today's episode will touch on sensitive topics such as sexual abuse, childhood abuse, drug abuse, and suicide. So if you are sensitive to this content, please listen at your own discretion. What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part episode on Edie Sedgwick. In part 1, we explored Edie's childhood at the ranch, her father's abusive behavior towards her and her siblings, how 2 of her brothers met their tragic end, her eventual move to Cambridge and later New York, and of course the beginnings of her time with Andy Warhol. We left things off in our story with Edie and Andy at the height of their partnership, cruising around New York like the city's social king and queen. Their mutually beneficial relationship, Andy providing Edie with an exciting new world and community, and Edie helping Andy come out of his shell, proved to be just as fruitful when it came to making movies. In the span of just 4 months, Andy and Edie co-collaborated on 11 separate films, all of which starred Edie. Each of these films feels like a separate cinematic portrait of Edie, giving us a raw and authentic window into different aspects of her life. Though we don't have the time to examine all of these films in today's episode, we will take a deeper look at 2 of the more significant of these works, which each give us insight into not only Edie's life, but also some of the darker aspects of her relationship with Andy Warhol. The first film we'll delve into is titled Beauty No. 2, made in July of 1965. The entire 70-minute film centers on Edie, who is lying on a bed in her underwear while canoodling with a handsome man named Gino Pisarchio. While Edie lightly kisses Gino and the 2 engage in mild foreplay, a mysterious voice off-screen starts to ask Edie personal questions. Edie at first brushes the questions off, answering them respectfully and continuing to fondle Gino. But as time goes on, the questions become more and more provocative, until they teeter on torturous. The voice starts to ask Edie about her family, and then her brother's deaths, and finally her father's abuse. As the relentless questions become more and more inciting, it's clear that Edie has no escape from the never-ending ridicule. As Jean Stein wrote, "On the bed, Edie is torn between reacting to the advances of the boy next to her and wanting to respond to the personal questions by the man in the shadows." Though the questions are meant to get a reaction out of Edie, she impressively maintains her composure until the very end of the film, when she finally breaks down and smashes a glass ashtray on the floor. The film closes with the voice off-screen snidely remarking, "I hope the next 35 minutes will be fun. Then you can get tired, and I can give you a bottle of pills." Beauty number 2 feels like one long sick experiment in testing Edie's ability to withstand emotional abuse. The ending line is ominous, taunting Edie that she is ultimately powerless. The film is one of the first indicators we have that behind Andy's adoration for Edie may have been a sick desire to chip away at her confidence and self-assurance. In another film made around this time, titled Outer and Inner Space, Edie's self-conviction is once again put to the test. Here, Edie sits on a stool as she watches pre-recorded videos of herself on a TV screen. Like Narcissus, the film captures Edie falling deeper and deeper into her own image, until she is utterly consumed by it. Often wincing with embarrassment, at one point Edie cries out, "I never dreamt I was so pathetic." As she continues to watch while chain-smoking cigarettes, one can feel the tension between Edie's own inner and outer space, her inner turmoil and outer beauty coming face to face. As time goes on, her image feels less and less like her own, and she becomes increasingly more disturbed. As Edie's older sister Alice later wrote, "Outer and Inner Space explores the tension between the living reality of a person and the image that person is reduced to." Here again, Edie is thrown into some sort of twisted experiment to see how long she can withstand humiliation and shame. And Andy, behind the camera, seems to enjoy capturing Edie in the midst of near mental collapse. Nonetheless, in each of Andy's films of Edie, she is unabashedly herself. There is no denying the courage it took for Edie to share herself so openly on camera. Edie brought to Andy's films such raw and unfiltered spirit. She is not just the protagonist, but the entire heart of each of these projects. As Andy later reflected, Edie was incredible, just the way she moved, and she never stopped moving for a second, even when she was sleeping. Her hands were wide awake. She was all energy. It was wonderful to film. And as her sister Alice commented, "She comes in through the lens like a fist." It's true. To put it simply, Edie is fiercely alive on screen. Even when she is doing relatively nothing, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, picking out an outfit, or lunching with friends, one simply can't take their eyes off her. She was more than just a natural in front of the camera. She was an utter sensation. And none were more aware of this than Andy Warhol himself. He knew that Edie was his one-way ticket to Hollywood, and he would ride on her curtail for as long as he could. In fact, the term superstar was popularized at this time by Andy in reference to Edie. And soon Edie was not just the star of Andy's films, but the queen of his factory. It didn't take long for Andy's crew of misfits to become wholly infatuated with Edie. They followed her around like a flock of sheep, and she was the center of all action at the factory. As music manager Danny Fields remembered, Edie was the first lady and Andy's prime companion, so there was an ongoing struggle for her favor and attention. She was the greatest of the superstars. And though Andy's films were mainly shown at underground theaters, Edie quickly began to receive attention from the mainstream media. who not only commented on her performances, but also her remarkable beauty and cooler-than-cool persona. Before long, her face was all over the tabloids and newspapers, and her name was on everyone's lips. Within just 6 months of working with Andy, Edie's fame had skyrocketed so much that she drew large crowds everywhere she went. All of New York City had fallen in love with her, and either wanted to be her or be with her. And though Andy had certainly put Edie on the radar, she had achieved much of her fame simply by being herself. For instance, one of the things that Edie became most famous for was her signature style. Edie was known to prance around town in a leotard and tights, which she wore partially because she was taking ballet classes, but also because they were the clothes that made her most happy. She usually topped her outfit off with a fabulous leopard print jacket and long dangling earrings. She famously bought children's skirts to wear as miniskirts and rocked oversized t-shirts as dresses. Her makeup was equally distinct, with long eyelashes, thick black eyeliner, and heavy-set mascara. Edie's look was incredibly forward-thinking and unique, and carved the way for 1960s fashion. Simply by dressing in what made her feel most comfortable and like herself, Edie inspired an entire generation to completely reinvent themselves. There is no denying that Edie deserves a salute as one of the greatest underground fashion icons of the 20th century. Her inventive look began to catch the attention of the fashion world, and soon the industry's leading magazines were highlighting Edie as a trendsetter. Women's Daily Wear named Edie the most significant fashion rebel of her day. Life magazine published an entire article on Edie's impeccable style, which included iconic photographs of Edie in a variety of fabulous outfits striking diva-like poses. And perhaps most notably, in August of 1965, Vogue included Edie in their Youth Quaker issue, which listed the generation's most influential youths. Edie was in impressive company, highlighted alongside legends like Joan Rivers and Frank Stella. For Vogue, Edie was photographed in her signature leotard and tights, balancing off of a leather stool in the shape of a rhinoceros, a stool which belonged to Edie. She gracefully kicks her leg back like a ballerina, while her arms stretch out to her side for balance. Edie is so effortlessly cool, poised, and enthralling. The photograph, which remains one of the most iconic images to come out of the 1960s, left an indelible impression on another generational icon, Patti Smith, who was just a young teenager at the time. As she later recalled, Edie was such a strong image that I thought, that's it. It represents everything to me, radiating intelligence, speed, being connected to the moment. The young Patti Smith was so taken by Edie that she later admitted to developing a crush on her. But as much as Edie was thriving at both Andy's factory and beyond, it was getting harder and harder for her to escape her inner turmoil. As the photographer Nate Finkelstein remarked, "You looked at her and saw extreme self-destruction. She turned more and more to hard drugs to quiet her anxieties. She took a particular liking to speed, a highly addictive amphetamine, taking excessive amounts on a daily basis. As Edie later opened up, I just kept thinking, if I could pop enough speed, I'd knock the daylights out of my system and none of the nonsense would go on. When she needed an extra kick, she would take speedballs, a dangerous concoction of speed and cocaine. At times, she took so many drugs that her body incessantly twitched, even in her sleep. And when she didn't have drugs of her own, she was known to steal from her friends. As her friends distanced themselves from her, her social circle became more and more shady, hanging around others whose lives revolved around getting their next fix. It was around this time that her relationship with Andy began to deteriorate as well. Though Edie's drug use was very clearly getting out of hand, Andy offered no support for her to get better. In fact, he may have sickly enjoyed seeing Edie spiral out of control, finding her instability fascinating and wanting to capture it on camera. As Billy Name remembered, Andy intuitively recognized this new and unstable element in Edie and the mesmerizing effect it had on people. Smoking, dancing, or reciting meaningless dialogue, she had the uncanny ability to telegraph images of troubled psychological states under a bright, buoyant surface. And as Edie herself later reflected, Warhol really effed up a great many young people's lives. My introduction to heavy drugs came through the factory. I was a good target for the scene. I blossomed into a healthy young drug addict. The fact that Andy did not only not try to stop Edie from hitting rock bottom, but encouraged her bad habits so that he could profit off of her, is undeniably dark. And there were other tensions in Andy and Edie's relationship that were bubbling beneath the surface as well. To start, Edie began to question the films that they had made together and second-guess Andy's vision. She didn't understand why these films were always devoid of any plot, and feared that they had turned her into a laughingstock. As she told Andy, "Everyone is laughing at me. I'm too embarrassed to even leave my apartment. They've made me into a joke." To make matters worse, Andy never paid her for any of these films, despite the fact that she was the star, and she began to feel that Andy was taking advantage of her. She became restless to make mainstream films and to be rightfully paid for her work. As manager Danny Fields recalled, she wanted to move on. She was as great in the little movies made in the factory as anyone was in a $4 million movie at MGM. So Edie used to wonder, should I go to Hollywood? Should I break away from Andy? Should I get a real agent? But it was hard to get away from Andy's thing. Edie began to realize that her star potential was being caged by Andy's control, and she was ready for a bigger spotlight. Their frayed relationship is perhaps most apparent in the last film that they made together. Titled Lupe, the film shares the tragic story of the Mexican actress Lupe Valles, who took her own life in 1944 at the age of 36. As the story went, Lupe Valles overdosed on pills, but not peacefully in her own bed as she had planned. When the pills made her feel sick, she went to the bathroom to vomit and allegedly choked and died with her head still over the toilet. Though this has since been debunked, and Valles certainly deserves to be remembered for her incredible talent and not her tragic end, Andy wanted to make a film depicting Valles' infamous death. It should come to no surprise that he asked Edie to play Valles, making her reenact Valles' overdose and death over a toilet. The role was not only extremely degrading, but the fact that Andy cast Edie, knowing that she herself was abusing drugs and battling with her own inner demons, is undeniably cruel, and points to his sick desire to taunt her. To support this, the writer of the film, Robert Hyde, remembered Andy telling him, "I want something where Edie commits suicide at the end." Andy's words are not only chilling due to their sheer cruelty, but also the dark and eerie ways in which Edie's own life paralleled Valles'. Both incredibly beautiful and talented, Edie and Valles were ultimately taken advantage of by the men around them. Valles by the men she dated who were never willing to settle down with her, and Edie by her father, and now Andy. As Edie acts out Valles' overdose and death, she herself is clearly unwell. She has bruises on her legs, her eyes are unfocused and bloodshot, and her body twitches and spasms like someone who is on drugs. How did Edie feel to play out Valles' final moments, knowing her own life was spiraling out of control? Could she relate to Valles? Did she feel her pain as if it were her own? Or did she detach herself from the role? Did she feel that Andy was trying to humiliate her, remind her that he was the one in charge? And would Andy feel remorseful when just a few years later, Edie would meet an eerily similar tragic fate? It was around this time that Andy brought a new young woman into the factory, the German actress-singer Nico. Andy did not hide the fact that Nico was quickly becoming his new favorite, making Edie feel all the more underappreciated. Edie began to fear that Nico would soon take her role as queen of the factory, and that her days at the top were numbered. This was only reinforced when Andy paired Nico up with a band he had recently signed on to manage, the Velvet Underground. One of the first assignments he gave them as manager was to write a song about Edie, the now famous song Femme Fatale. As the lyrics go, "Here she comes, you better watch your step. She's going to break your heart in two. It's true, it's not hard to realize. Just look into her false-colored eyes. She builds you up just to put you down. What a clown. 'Cause everybody knows she's a femme fatale." If the lyrics alone weren't enough of a burn, they were sung by Edie's evident replacement, Nico. It was also around this time that Edie started hanging around the folk singer, Bob Dylan. When they met at the famed Kettle of Fish on McDougal Street, Edie and Dylan took an instant liking to each other. Dylan enjoyed Edie's spunky personality. As the writer Jonathan Taplin remembered, Dylan liked Edie because she was one of the few people who could stand up against his weird little numbers. She was much stronger. Dylan respected Edie's spirit and her strength in being able to deal with him. And Edie was enticed by the world that Dylan moved in, the underbelly of society, that felt like the antithesis of her own aristocratic roots. Feeling undervalued by Andy, Edie appreciated the attention that Dylan and his circle began to give her. He encouraged Edie that she deserved more than what Andy could offer her, and that she was destined to become a Hollywood star. He connected Edie to his manager, Albert Grossman, who promised to star Edie in a film with Dylan. Edie was incredibly excited by this prospect, but knew it wouldn't be easy to tell Andy. Caught at a crossroads of two different worlds, one of pop art, one of folk music, Edie knew that she would have to decide on which road to take. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
Wow.
Incredible. Amazing.
Lumify Redness Reliever eye drops really work.
They dramatically reduce redness in 1 minute.
I love how my eyes look whiter and brighter.
And it lasts for up to 8 hours.
They make my eyes look refreshed.
Lumify? It's kind of amazing.
It was love at first sight. With Lumify.
Try it for yourself. Learn more at lumifyeyes.com.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Edie had a lot to mull over. Though she was no longer confident in Andy's artistic vision and was frustrated by the lack of pay and attention, Andy and the factory had become her family, and they would not be easy to give up. She kept changing her mind as to what she should do, going back and forth between staying with Andy or leaving him for Dylan's circle. She continued to visit the factory every day and party hopped with Andy every night, but her heart began to feel split in two. This was made worse by the fact that Andy absolutely abhorred Dylan. When he heard rumors that Edie was thinking of doing a movie with him, he became infuriated. As the playwright Robert Hyde recalled, there was this conflict going on between Andy and Grossman and Bob Dylan about making Edie into a movie star, and she was ostensibly splitting with Andy, so there was a lot of anger and angst and resentment coming out of Andy. This kind of nervousness and tension. The stress and pressure on Edie was enormous, particularly when she got in the middle of the conflict between Warhol and Dylan. Andy was angry and jealous, and the way he showed it was by being very impassive. He could be really cold. The bubbling tension between Edie and Andy came to a head at a group dinner in late January of 1966. Clearly at her own breaking point over Andy's cold treatment of her, Edie cried out to the entire table, "I can't get close to him. I try to get close to him, but he won't respond. I guess it's finished. It's over." She demanded that Andy stop showing any of the films that they had made together because they were too humiliating. She then announced that she was going to make a film with Bob Dylan instead and stormed off to the phone booth to ask Dylan to pick her up. Andy became red in the face and was too stunned to speak. Wanting to hurt her back, when Edie returned to the table, Andy blurted out that Dylan had secretly married another woman behind Edie's back. Edie, who had developed strong feelings for Dylan, was left equally stunned. She stumbled backwards, muttering, "What? I don't believe it. What?" When Dylan eventually arrived to escort the heartbroken Edie out, she knew that her days with Andy Warhol were officially over. How did Edie feel as she walked out the door, leaving an enraged Andy behind? Was she terrified, or did she find her newfound freedom from him exhilarating? And how did she feel with her arm now around Dylan? Could she trust him after what Andy had revealed? Had she made the right decision? Though Edie did sign a contract with Grossman, she became consumed over whether she had made the correct choice, going back and forth between feeling confident and then deep regret. The factory was not only Edie's primary friend circle, but had become her chosen family, and she began to experience serious withdrawals from them. As her friend observed, you could see her screaming when she wasn't screaming. Andy, on the other hand, remained calculated and cold. As Robert Hyde recalled, Andy didn't say anything, but I could tell he was upset. And then he murmured, "Do you think Edie will let us film her when she commits suicide?" To Andy, his ties with Edie had been permanently severed. He found a new actress that resembled Edie to replace her in his films and refused to speak to or about Edie moving forward. Sadly, despite his promise, it soon became clear that Grossman had no intention of putting Edie in a film with Bob Dylan. She also confirmed Andy's information to be true. Dylan had married a woman named Sarah Lowndes behind Edie's back, despite leading her on for months. As the poet Gerald Malanga later reflected, Edie was a very impressionable person, sweet and innocent. Edie didn't know Bob Dylan was married to Sarah at the time. She thought she was going to be part of the Bob Dylan clan. They made Edie feel as if they were going to launch a career for her. Since Edie's death, Dylan has repeatedly denied that he and Edie were ever romantically involved. Edie, on the other hand, once admitted to her brother that Dylan had gotten her pregnant, but that she had lost the baby. Though it should be noted that Edie was very high on speed when she told him this. While we don't know the exact nature of Edie and Dylan's relationship, it's clear that in the very least Edie had developed strong feelings for him, and had more than enough reason to feel betrayed by both his secret marriage and false promise to make a film together. Though their time together was short, Edie inspired some of Dylan's greatest songs to date, including Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat, Just Like a Woman, and Like a Rolling Stone, the latter of which feels like Dylan's farewell to her, as he sings of Edie. Once upon a time, you dressed so fine, threw the bums a dime in your prime, didn't you? People call, say beware doll, you're bound to fall. You thought they were all kidding you. You used to laugh about everyone that was hanging out. Now you don't talk so loud. Now you don't seem too proud about having to be scrounging for your next meal. How does it feel? How does it feel to be without a home? Like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone. Her ties now severed with both Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan, Edie knew she could depend on no one but herself to survive. She decided to go back into modeling to make ends meet. A natural in front of the camera, it didn't take long for her to sign with the city's top modeling agency, Ford Models. As with most things she did, simply by being herself, she began to revolutionize the fashion world. She became the first model to popularize the thin and almost androgynous body type so prevalent in fashion today, predating the model Twiggy. And her unique style set fashion trends across the country. It was also during this time that she met the up-and-coming fashion designer Betsy Johnson, who hired Edie as her personal fitting model. And that March, she was featured in Vogue magazine. In fact, Vogue nearly signed her on as an in-house model, but ultimately decided against it because of Edie's notorious reputation in the press. Had they signed her on, Edie's life may have turned out extremely differently. Tragically, in the end, Edie could not escape her own emotional distress. She turned more and more to drugs to numb her internal anguish. Not before long, she was in the throes of severe addiction to speed, barbiturates, and heroin, always on the search for her next fix. It was also around this time that Edie began to date Dylan's friend, another singer-songwriter named Bobby Newworth. What may have started as a distraction from her heartbreak over Dylan quickly turned into a heated and messy affair. As photographer Billy Name recalled, Edie had this big, torrid love affair with Bobby Newworth, where she and he would just get so blasted on amphetamine that they were cooked days on end. Her total energy for this whole period was Bobby Newworth. It seemed that Edie became just as addicted to Bobby as she was to the drugs that they took together. But Edie's drug addiction would soon have serious consequences. Every night, Edie burned multiple candles before bed. Because on most nights she was extremely intoxicated, she often forgot to blow them out before she slept. One night, the curtains in her apartment caught on fire, and Edie woke up to her entire apartment engulfed in flames. She managed to crawl on her stomach towards the front door, but when she touched the doorknob, she scalded her hands severely. Fortunate enough to survive, Edie did have to be hospitalized for significant burns. To make matters worse, being in the hospital triggered traumatic memories from Edie's years spent in psychiatric facilities, and she suffered a PTSD episode. As a friend recalled, she was frantic to get out. She responded to that hospital like some mad, frenzied small animal. She was going to call whoever she knew. She was going to get out of that hospital. Though she was released after 24 hours, Edie's apartment was totaled, and she had nowhere to go. She decided to retreat to her family's ranch in California until she could figure out new living arrangements. It didn't take long for her parents to see that Edie had become severely addicted to drugs. But sadly, once again, they did not provide her with the support she so desperately needed. Instead, they called their family doctor, who gave Edie Nembutal every few hours to sedate her, and eventually institutionalized her at a nearby psychiatric hospital. When her boyfriend Bobby Newworth tried to get in touch with her, he was shocked to hear that she was back at a facility. As he later remembered, Edie's father came to the telephone. He seemed rather proud when he told me how he had committed her, I guess it was the only way they could think of controlling her. When I finally reached Edie on the phone, she called out to me, "Get me out of here, I'm a prisoner." Shortly afterward, she was on a plane back to New York. Edie's time in California only threw her deeper into the throes of her own anguish and despair. Upon returning, Edie moved into the infamous Chelsea Hotel, where she lived amongst some of the most interesting creatives of her day. In fact, Leonard Cohen had a room just down the hall. But Edie's dependence on drugs only worsened during this time. In fact, her addiction got so severe that even Bobby Newworth could no longer keep up with her destructive lifestyle. And after just a few months of dating, he decided to break up with Edie. In his own words, "I couldn't believe that someone of such intelligence should mistreat herself to that extent. It was caused by desperation and lack of outlet for that incredible energy." The breakup left Edie in an even more distraught state. As she later admitted, "The minute he left me alone, I was so empty and lost that I would start popping pills." Edie would always refer to Bob Newworth as the greatest love of her life. Hitting a near rock bottom, Edie needed a miracle to pull her out of her depressive state. And luckily, her prayers were answered. In March of 1967, Edie was approached to make a film loosely based on her life titled Ciao Manhattan. The film promised Edie the big break into Hollywood she so desperately wanted and deserved. And for a brief period of time, it gave Edie the drive and excitement to get her life together and launch her professional career as an actress. Other impressive names signed on board, like Betsy Johnson, who was hired to design all of the costumes. But tragically, Edie was once again taken advantage of at every turn. The directors asked Edie to reenact several traumatic events from her life in front of the camera, like receiving electric shock treatment, as well as taking a number of different drugs. Edie was placed in one demeaning scene after the next, not only humiliating her, but deteriorating her already compromised mental health. And instead of helping Edie, the filmmakers exploited her vulnerable state. Knowing that she was desperate for her big break, they continued to put Edie in ridiculing situations. When she gave any pushback, a doctor was called to shoot up the entire cast, sedating Edie to the point where she didn't know where she was or what she was doing. Watching the film, it's clear that Edie is completely out of it and on the verge of mental and physical collapse. The project's breaking point came when, while still filming, Edie suffered another serious fire, this time in her room at the Chelsea Hotel. As the legend goes, earlier that night, Leonard Cohen visited Edie's room and noticed that she had candles arranged in a certain pattern. He whispered to a friend that the way the candles were placed was a bad omen, and that she should move them immediately. Call it a premonition, a few hours later those very same candles toppled over as Edie was sleeping, and ignited her room in flames. She was found by a neighbor and dragged out of her room, wearing nothing but a blanket wrapped around her. Though her burns were minor, the ordeal was enough for the directors of Ciao Manhattan to finally see that Edie was in no state to continue filming. They subsequently ceased all production. Edie was now without a purpose, without a home, and without any money to sustain herself. Her situation was nearing dire. And soon she would also be without a father. In the autumn of 1967, Edie received a call from her mother letting her know that her father had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was not good, and it was clear that Edie's father had only a matter of weeks. Though her relationship with her father was complicated at best, Edie wanted the chance to see him before he passed away. But her mother did not only not allow Edie to visit, she even refused to let Edie speak to him on the phone. Each time Edie called and begged to say goodbye to him, her mother would respond, "Edie, you don't know what you're doing to your father." Even on his deathbed, Edie's father was tormenting her. It seems that part of his refusal to speak with her was due to his overwhelming guilt. Edie's sister recalled that as their father approached death, he became eaten alive with guilt over how he had treated his children. Guilt over his 2 sons' death, and guilt over how each of his children's struggles stemmed from his abuse. Unable to apologize with words, Edie received an eerie postcard in the mail shortly before his death. The postcard had a violent and brutal image on its front: Goya's famous painting, Saturn eating one of his children. In one of the most grotesque paintings ever made, Goya depicted a deranged and manic-eyed Saturn in the midst of devouring one of his children. The postcard was evidently Edie's father's own reckoning with how his abuse ate away at each of his own children. Edie's father passed away on October 24, 1967. How did Edie feel when she received the news that her father was officially gone? Did she feel a sense of liberation, that she was now free of his abuse and of the Sedgwick family curse? Or was she overcome with grief? As a friend of hers remembered, Edie had many mixed, tortured emotions about that man. She loved him, she worshipped him, she hated him. Though many believe that Edie would feel a weight lifted after her father's death, instead, she seemed to be carrying an even heavier burden. Her behavior became more and more erratic. She was shortly after admitted into Bellevue Hospital after police found her chasing a mailman down the street. Her time at Bellevue only further traumatized her. As Edie herself later shared, "Oh God, it was a nightmare. 6 attendants came and held me down on a stretcher. They terrified me, their force against mine. I told them if they just let me go, I would calm down, but they wouldn't listen, and they started to tell each other what stages of hallucinations I was in, how I imagined myself an animal. All these things totally unreal to my mind and just guesses on their part. Then they plunged a great needle into me, and bam! I went out for 2 whole days. When I woke up, wow, rats all over the floor, wailing and screaming. Edie was put on numerous medications, many of which had severe side effects, like seizures, tremors, and vomiting. Edie later described the experience as nothing short of terrifying. And in the midst of navigating her own trying time at the hospital and processing the death of her father, Edie received news that Andy Warhol had been shot. On June 3, 1968, a woman named Valerie Solanas fired 2 bullets into Andy's chest, ripping through his lung, liver, spleen, and intestines. Like Edie, Valerie had felt that Andy was taking too much control over her life and using her for his own artistic ambitions. Andy was rushed to the emergency room, where he was operated on for over 5 hours. Against all odds, he miraculously survived and was released from the hospital after 2 months of extensive recovery. How did Edie feel when she heard the news that Andy had been shot? And more than this, that the perpetrator was a woman who similarly felt that Andy had taken advantage of her. Was she distressed that Andy might not make it? Or did she feel that he had gotten what he deserved? And was she taken aback by the eerie parallels with her own life? That shortly after her father's death, the man who had taken his place as father figure had been critically shot. That as she lay confined to her hospital bed, Andy was in a hospital bed of his own across town. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
Wow.
Incredible. Amazing.
Lumify Redness Reliever eye drops really work.
They dramatically reduce redness in 1 minute.
I love how my eyes look whiter and brighter.
And it lasts for up to 8 hours.
They make my eyes look refreshed.
Lumify? It's kind of amazing.
It was love at first sight. With Lumify.
Try it for yourself. Learn more at lumifyeyes.com.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Edie spent the next 3 months in various institutions across the city, until her mother eventually came to bring her back to the family ranch. By the time she arrived, she was on the brink of almost complete mental collapse. Her brain was so fragmented and jumbled that she could hardly finish a sentence, and she spoke extremely slowly. Her concept of time was befuddled, having difficulty differentiating between past, present, and future. She heard voices around her, making her paranoid and on edge, and physically she was just as compromised, so weak that she could hardly walk a few feet without falling. As her brother remembered, you could see how desperate it was when you looked into her eyes, and you could see how hard she was trying to reach you. She couldn't even move her arms right to indicate what she wanted to tell you. She rarely left the house. Inside, she was grabbing something to keep her from falling over. When it was dinner time, she'd wobble in and wobble out and fall down a lot. Edie had to slowly rebuild her motor skills, and day by day she improved. She was eventually well enough to move into her own apartment in Isla Vista. But it didn't take long for Edie to slip back into unhealthy habits and once again fall into the cruel cycle of addiction. After just a few months of living on her own, she was arrested for drug possession and placed at the Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara for psychiatric treatment, ironically the same hospital where she was born. We can only imagine how defeated Edie must have felt to once again be institutionalized. With a box full of photographs from her days as a fashion model and famed socialite, Edie clung onto the life that was quickly slipping out of her grasp. Despite her desperate situation, Edie's time at Cottage Hospital may have been fated after all. It was during this time that Edie was first introduced to the man that she would one day marry, Michael Post. Michael was a fellow patient at the hospital, also recovering from drug addiction. At first, they were just friends, but when Michael was released, he would often return to visit Edie. It was during these visits that their feelings for each other grew. Michael began to plan romantic outings to take Edie on. With her doctor's permission, he often brought her to the local hot springs, where they'd picnic under the stars. For the first time in her life, Edie found a man who loved her wholly and unconditionally, and was not looking to profit off her in some way. Instead, he wanted to help Edie get back on her feet and have a fresh start. Edie felt seen and comforted in Michael's presence, and looked forward to sharing a simpler new life together. With Michael's support, Edie began to show signs of progress at the hospital. It was around this time that the filmmakers of Chow Manhattan approached Edie about finishing the project. Edie, feeling more stable, was determined to not only finish filming, but use the film as a launching pad for her career. While she was still in the hospital, she began recording audio tapes with reflections on her life to use as voiceovers in the film. She eventually was given authorization from her doctor to leave the hospital to finish filming, which took place over the span of a few months. Chow Manhattan wrapped in early 1971 and was released the following year, shortly after Edie's death. And perhaps this was a blessing. Chow Manhattan is almost agonizing to watch and is arguably more humiliating than all of Andy's films combined. What Edie had hoped would be her big break into Hollywood instead feels like one long hit piece that scene by scene eats away at her dignity. As fellow ex-Warhol star Ondine once described, Ciao Manhattan is absolutely the most excruciating piece of footage you'll ever see in your life. It's a whole reel of the total collapse of a person. It begins to get really painful because she is so obviously coming apart at the seams, just coming apart. And he's right. Throughout the film, Edie seems extremely frayed and confused, at times barely coherent. She stutters as she speaks, stumbles as she walks, and her eyes dim with self-defeat. Ciao Manhattan feels far less about Edie's life, and more the tragic and unrelenting events that slowly killed her spirit over time. After filming, Edie was left in a severely compromised state. Though she managed to avoid heavy drug use for a while with Michael's support, she relapsed after being prescribed painkillers for an infection, quickly slipping back into her addiction. She even began tricking various doctors into writing new prescriptions and was eventually once again institutionalized. She spent the months of January through June of 1971 in a hospital recovering from her relapse. In this time, she received over 20 electric shock treatments. As her husband later lamented, "It was so ironic. Here she did this whole bizarre film with scenes of shock treatments, hoping to be off to Hollywood, off to stardom, and then boom, back to go through real shock treatments. Exactly what she had acted out. It was really a weird twist of fate." When Edie was released from the hospital that June, she was determined to improve her life. She moved into an apartment with Michael, who proposed to her shortly after. In love, and with the promise of a fresh start ahead of her, Edie happily accepted. On July 24th, 1971, they got married on Edie's family ranch in Santa Barbara. In surviving photographs from her wedding, we see Edie wearing a white satin dress, glowing from the inside out. She smiles with a childlike joy, a smile that seems to carry in it all her hopes and aspirations for a fresh start. And for a few months, Edie's life really seemed to have turned a corner. With Michael's support, she got herself sober. She asked him to become her agent and help her with her acting career. And she even planned to enroll in art school. As the days went on, her confidence and ambitions grew, and she felt empowered to take on the world. On November 15th, she was invited to the opening of a fashion exhibition at the Santa Barbara Museum. Clean of drugs, in a supportive marriage, and improving her physical and mental health, Edie had never felt better. As it turned out, a few of her friends from her days in Cambridge were at the event and invited her to an after-party. She excitedly shared her progress with her friends and her hopes and aspirations for the future. As one friend remembered, "I spent a lot of time talking to Edie. She was talking about the future with a childlike enthusiasm. It was very touching. There was an incredible kind of radiance, a smiling, an inner flowering quality about her which I felt was so unique." Evidently, Edie's newfound enthusiasm for life was palpable to those around her. But not all of her acquaintances were happy to see Edie finally stand on her own 2 feet. As Edie opened up about getting clean and her marriage, a woman named Veronica Janeway, who Edie had known briefly in New York, began to verbally attack her. She shouted in Edie's face, "You're sick. You're an addict, a dope addict. You're a heroin addict." Though Edie had a few drinks at the party, she was hardly drunk and had not touched any drugs. Edie tried to defend herself, stuttering back, "Look, I've been through all that. I'm getting out of it now. I've just gotten married. We're trying to build this whole marriage-type ideal plan." To which Veronica snidely replied, "You'll only stay with him a few hours or a few days." Clearly heavily intoxicated, Veronica seemed to be on a mission to crush any hope for a better life that Edie had. By the time Michael picked Edie up, it seemed that Veronica's words had stung her deeply. As Michael later described, she had this look, a sort of sad look, as if she were feeling an overall physical and mental ache of some sort. Though Veronica had been escorted out of the party, Michael knew that he had to take the shocked and wounded Edie home. As they got into bed, Edie could not seem to shake off Veronica's devastating blows. As Michael recalled, "It was around 1 o'clock when we got home. She said how troubled she was about the woman who attacked her. I tried to get her to forget it. She said, but damn it, I just wanted to get through to her." Before they slept, Michael gave Edie her medication that the doctors at the hospital had prescribed her for her continued recovery. As she was falling asleep, Michael noticed that her breathing sounded shaky, as if there was a hole in her lungs. Chalking it up to her excessive smoking, Michael decided not to wake her up and to let her sleep off the disastrous night. When he woke up the following morning at 7:30 a.m., he found Edie cold and lifeless beside him. She had suffocated in her sleep. Edie was only 28 years old. The coroner who examined Edie's body ruled her death uncertain, speculating either negligence or suicide. Her toxology reports showed a 0.48% blood alcohol level and traces of barbiturates, likely from her medication. It's possible that Edie's body, after years of excessive drug use, smoking, prolonged hospitalizations, and strained mental and physical health, finally gave out. It's also possible that her heart, which had endured years of abuse by her father, Warhol, Dylan, and all the Hollywood heads along the way, who were just as happy to use her as they were to discard her after, could not survive another heartbreak. What was Edie thinking as she took her final, labored breaths? Did she know that they would be her last? Did she want to continue fighting for her life so that she could prove to herself and the world that she was worthy of happiness? Or had she finally surrendered to life's cruel ways? Edie was buried in a small cemetery in Ballard, California. Her grave simply reads, Edith Sedgwick Post, wife of Michael Brett Post, 1943 to 1971. When Andy learned of Edie's death, he responded in his typical cold fashion, refusing to openly honor the life of the woman who had not only been a dear friend, but helped launch his career as a filmmaker. But despite Andy's efforts to forget Edie, she remains a household name today, and her legacy as actress, fashion icon, and social sensation lives on. There have been many films that center on or include a character based on Edie Sedgwick. In 1991, the actress Jessica Rubin played Edie in Oliver Stone's film The Doors. In 2006, Sienna Miller played Edie in Factory Girl, a biopic based on Edie's life. And in 2010, directors Melissa Painter and David Wiseman released a short documentary on Edie titled Edie Girl on Fire, which accompanied a biography of the same title. Several top fashion designers have released lines inspired by Edie, like John Galliano's 2005 Dior collection. And Edie continues to inspire musicians today. The music videos for Lady Gaga's songs Applause and Marry the Night both include references to Edie. The rapper G-Eazy wrote a song based on Edie's life titled Downtown Love, and Beach House's album 7 was inspired by Edie, particularly their song Girl of the Year. But the most meaningful way in which Edie's legacy has lived on is through the rediscovery of her own art. In 2002, a collection of her drawings and pastels went on auction, showcasing her works to the public for the very first time. These works not only present an artistic side of Edie that is so often left out of her narrative, but are testament to her clear artistic talent. Her drawings and sketches are undeniably skillful, especially considering that Edie received no formal training. Many are of horses, which she drew with impressive precision, others of mice, and one of a raccoon carrying its baby in its mouth, which she drew during her time at Silver Hill Hospital. These drawings show Edie's sharp observation of the world around her and her ability to use art to self-regulate. In others, Edie draws herself, regal and calm like a Greek goddess of antiquity. Amidst so much internal and external chaos, Edie portrays herself as dignified and serene. These works provide the rare opportunity for Edie to take ownership over her own image, when for so much of her life, her image was in the hands of men who used her for their own artistic ambitions. So the next time you see one of Edie's iconic photographs, or one of the many Warhol films which she starred in, or listen to Bob Dylan's Just Like a Woman or Like a Rolling Stone, think of Edie Sedgwick, not just as the it girl of her day, but as the real and complex person she was and would have wanted to be remembered as. Though her image has become synonymous with New York City itself, few people know that she was actually from rural beginnings, and that her childhood was far from glamorous. As her sister Alice wrote, "The fact is, Edie came from California, from a privileged but troubled family living in isolation on a large cattle ranch, where for long stretches of time in adolescence, she was completely isolated under the control of her parents. What formed her was life on the ranch, which was one of ambiguity and extremes. On the one hand, the sheer exhilaration of physical existence, and on the other, the undercurrents of emotional violence, the tension arising from all that was denied and suppressed. Edie appeared to have been given everything, and materially that may have been so, but humanly she was deprived and incapacitated. So when she left the ranch for the larger world, she was not the magical innocent she may have seemed. She was a feral creature springing out of captivity. Before the age of 20 years old, Edie had suffered years of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse by her father, been institutionalized and administered electric shock treatments, and tragically, lost 2 of her brothers to self-inflicted deaths. The resilience it took for Edie to not only survive all of this, but to then go on and take New York City by storm is utterly remarkable. And her relationship with Andy Warhol deserves re-examination as well. Though she is known as Warhol's greatest superstar, few give her credit for the ways in which Edie propelled Andy's career as not just a filmmaker, but also a social icon. Though Andy was undeniably well known for his screen prints by the time he met Edie, it was Edie who helped elevate his fame to the next level. In an artistic, social, and emotional sense, Edie became the medium through which Andy expressed himself. Artistically, she was the face and heart of his films, while Andy hid behind the camera. Socially, she had the look and persona of the celebrity Andy so desperately wanted to be, but was too insecure to become, and she took the spotlight while he lurked in the shadows. And emotionally, her natural thirst for life and childlike enthusiasm for the world pushed the cold and pessimistic Warhol to come out of his hard shell. As Edie's sister Alice later reflected, one way of looking at the conjunction of Edie Sedgwick and Andy Warhol in 1965 would be to see it as a mythological event. Each of them was on a powerful trajectory, and when their trajectories intersected, a bright binary star suddenly appeared and dazzled the public. Edie had a particular combination of attributes and an indelible inborn force that Andy was able to engage and put to use. not just socially and personally, but also as a filmmaker. And the designer Betsy Johnson once said, Andy knew that in Edie he had found something exceptional, unique. Edie was not only the look. She had the head, she had the body, she had the screwed up background. She was a perfect candidate. Young, gorgeous, the look of a time on Andy's arm, and able to really hold her own. She was it. I don't know what it is, but Andy always wanted to be around people who lived it, were born it, did it all, did anything they wanted to do. And that was Edie. And while Andy provided Edie with the platform on which she shined, and brought her into his circle of creatives, there is no denying that he took advantage of her. As the artist Ultraviolet remarked, if you look at a still from Edie's screen test, you can see the whole story. She is exquisite, but looking more closely you see something quite disturbing. A beautiful, frightened animal that had been tracked down, in other words, by Andy Warhol, and preserved as a kind of trophy, like the head of a deer, on a big game hunter's wall. Her face is vacant and afraid. Though Edie was the one who officially left Andy, we have to ask, what choice did she really have when he filmed her in increasingly humiliating situations, never paid her for her work, and was all too happy to frequently remind her that she was disposable? To quote Bob Dylan in his song, Like a Rolling Stone, he sings of Edie and Andy, "You used to ride on a chrome horse with your diplomat, who carried on his shoulder a Siamese cat. Ain't it hard when you discovered that he really wasn't where it's at, after he took from you everything he could steal?" Andy helped build Edie up only to then destroy her. And Dylan himself wasn't much better. Not only did his false promise to star Edie in a film sever her ties with Andy, it led her on to believe that she was something special to him. When he married somebody else behind her back, Edie was understandably hurt. His betrayal had devastating effects on Edie, causing a downward spiral that in many ways she never recovered from. Though Edie had little to gain from her time with Dylan, she, on the other hand, inspired arguably his two greatest songs. Of course, her influence as fashion icon and social sensation has been well acknowledged, but she deserves recognition beyond fashionista and socialite. Edie transformed herself from a girl who grew up isolated on a farm under the tyrannical rule of her abusive father to the full-of-life, fabulous, glamorous person she is remembered as today. She invented her own self and story, had the foresight to express herself in completely original ways, and the bravery to continue to shine despite hardship after hardship. Well before the age of influencers, Edie was the first of her kind to become famous simply by being herself. As Nate Finkelstein wrote, Edie would have been extraordinary even if she'd done nothing. She has become the very distillation of the idea that the self, uncontaminated by such atrocious standards as achievement or talent, is the epitome of fame. Edie is famous for being Edie. Edie was not as helpless as men like Andy Warhol tried to make her out to be. She had more agency over her own image than she's been credited for. As author Diana Oliveira wrote, Edie Sedgwick's accomplishments may look minimal to others. A few magazine covers, a slew of appearances in Warhol's alternative films, and an incredible flair for clubbing and drug consumption. To disregard Sedgwick in this manner, however, is to neglect the highly contemporary concept that she built her life as if it were a work of performing art. She became the very embodiment of art. Edie's look and act were intentional, a well-crafted and brilliant performance that came to define an entire era of cultural history. To think that Edie achieved all this while in the throes of severe addiction is remarkable. Had Edie been given the support and help she needed, who knows how much more she could have achieved. Her family failed her, Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan failed her, and the hospital she was committed to failed her. As Bibi Hansen once said, she was taken out of being a functional, operational human being long before she passed. If the drugs hadn't been there, who knows what she might have developed? That is the tragedy. So we get to see how much, in spite of all the shots against her, in spite of the damage done in her early years, and despite of the drugs, she did achieve. And to build on this, the fact that she accomplished so much in just 28 years of life is even more extraordinary. In the end, Edie succumbed to the unforgiving world around her. Her mind, body, and spirit were too exhausted by life's unrelenting challenges. As Bob Dylan sings of Edie in Just Like a Woman, she takes just like a woman. Yes, she does. She makes love just like a woman. Yes, she does. And she aches just like a woman. But she breaks just like a little girl. It's true that Edie did break. She was a deeply traumatized and lonely person, but she was also incredibly brilliant and misunderstood by those around her. As the photographer Billy Name attested, she was just extraordinarily brilliant. And this is the reason why the whole thing of her life became a tragedy, because there was no receptacle for that brilliance. People were always wanting to photograph her, but beauty you can always find. It was her mind that didn't have an outlet. It didn't have a place to express itself. Today, we hope to honor Edie as the brilliant woman she was. A woman who lived her life fiercely despite unabating challenges, who continued to dance through her heartbreak, and who changed the world simply by being herself. I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's 2-part episode on Edie Sedgwick. I have included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.
Have you ever wondered how accurate those movies are that say they're based on a true story? My name is Dan, and I'm the host of the Based on a True Story podcast, where we learn from historians, professors, authors, TV and film consultants, or sometimes even the real people the movies are based on, as they help us separate fact from fiction with what's in the movies. We've covered hundreds of movies and TV shows, so when you're ready to compare Hollywood with history, just search for your favorite movie over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com.
Wow.
Incredible. Amazing.
Lumify Redness Reliever eye drops really work.
They dramatically reduce redness in 1 minute.
I love how my eyes look whiter and brighter.
And it lasts for up to 8 hours.
They make my eyes look refreshed.
Lumify? It's kind of amazing.
It was love at first sight. With Lumify.
Try it for yourself. Learn more at lumifyeyes.com.